She thought she was bringing him the greatest gift of her life. Instead, she found him in their bed with someone else and walked out carrying a secret that would haunt them both for 4 years. If this story already has your heart racing, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The elevator doors opened at 11:47 p.m., and Amara Vane stepped into the penthouse with a pregnancy test in her coat pocket and hope in her chest. She should have called ahead. She knew that. But she had wanted this to be something different. Not a phone call, not a text, not another moment filtered through screens and schedules and the thousand small distances that had crept into their marriage over the past year. She had wanted to see his face when she told him. She had wanted to catch him off guard in a good way, the way she used to be able to do, back when catching him off guard was easy, back when he still laughed at unexpected things. She stepped out of the elevator, and the penthouse was dark except for the city pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Geneva laid out below them like scattered light on water, indifferent and beautiful. She set her handbag on the entry table. She took off her coat. She smoothed her dress with the flat of her palm the way she always did when she was nervous. And she was nervous, but it was the right kind of nervous, the kind that meant something mattered. The bedroom door was ajar. There was a sound, soft. She almost didn't register it, and then she did. Amara stood in the hallway for 4 full seconds before her body remembered how to move. She pushed the door open the rest of the way with 2 fingers, slowly, the way you might open something you already suspect you don't want to see. She saw it all in one clean frame, the way you see a car accident before you understand you're inside it. Damien Cross lay in their bed, in the bed she had chosen, under the sheets she had bought in a market in Milan on a Sunday morning 3 years ago, while he drank espresso and complained that thread count was not a real thing worth arguing about, and she had argued anyway, laughing. In that bed, in those sheets. With a woman Amara did not recognize, dark-haired, already trying to cover herself, already looking at Amara with the particular expression of someone caught in someone else's life. Damien's eyes opened. He saw her. He said nothing. Not her name. Not an explanation. Just the silence of a man whose face had gone completely still, not with guilt, exactly, but with the recognition of a damage he could not walk back. Amara did not cry. That surprised her. She filed it away somewhere she'd examine later. She put one hand flat against her own stomach, below the fabric of her dress, where nothing was showing yet, where no one would know to look. She picked up her coat from the entry table on the way out. She pressed the elevator button once. She waited 11 seconds for it to arrive, and in those 11 seconds, the entire architecture of the life she had built shifted underneath her like something tectonically wrong, and she stood on top of it perfectly still. The doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. She did not look back. What Amara Vane was, before Damien Cross, was practical. People sometimes confuse this for coldness, and she had stopped correcting them years ago. She had grown up in a family where money came and went with the seasons, and decisions were made with the head, not the stomach, because the stomach would get you killed or broke or both. She had put herself through school on scholarships and part-time accounting work. She had built a consulting career in financial compliance with the same patient. Methodical logic she applied to everything. Find the weakness in a system. Understand it, reinforce it, or exploit it depending on which side of the table you were sitting on. She met Damien at a function in Zurich, a gray March evening, 7 years ago. She had been there on behalf of a client. He had been there because he owned it. Not the building, technically, but the conversation in it, the attention in it, the way the room organized itself around his presence, the way rooms did with certain men. She had watched this from across a table of bad canapes and thought, clinically, dangerous. Then he had looked at her and said, "You've been watching me calculate exit routes for 20 minutes. And she had said, "I've been watching you pretend you need them." He had smiled at that. Not the performative smile he'd been wearing for the room, something smaller, something that reached his eyes. She told herself later that she had imagined that distinction. She had not imagined it. What she had known from the beginning was exactly what Damien Cross was. She had not walked into this marriage naive. She knew about the organization, Not every detail, not the operational specifics she was careful not to want, but the shape of it, the weight of it, the way it preceded him into every room. She had decided, with the same cold clarity she applied to balance sheets, that she could live with the shape of it, that she could be the part of his life that was clean, that she could love him without needing to understand every dark room in the house he'd built. This had been, she understood now, in the back seat of a cab moving through Geneva at midnight, the central miscalculation of her adult life. She had given the driver an address, her friend Celine's apartment, the only place she could think of clearly. And now she sat with her coat in her lap and her hand still pressed flat against her stomach, and she thought about the math of it. The clinical, stupid, unavoidable math of it. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She had found out that afternoon at a clinic in the Eau Vive quarter, sitting in a paper gown in a room that smelled like antiseptic and waiting. The doctor had been kind. She had driven home with the windows down despite the cold, letting the air move through the car, thinking about how to tell him, thinking about his face, imagining his hands on her face. She thought about those hands now. She did not cry in the cab. She would not cry in front of the driver. There were certain small dignities she intended to preserve. Celine Arquette was 34 years old, 5'2", and had the particular energy of a woman who had seen enough of the world to refuse to be surprised by it. She opened her apartment door at midnight and looked at Amara's face for 1 second and said, "Come in," and asked nothing yet. She made tea. She sat across from Amara at the kitchen table and waited. Amara told her. All of it. The clinic. The drive home. The penthouse. The 11 seconds in front of the elevator. Her voice was level the entire time except for once, briefly, when she described the woman trying to pull up the sheet, and even then it was less grief than something older and colder. The specific ache of being made to feel ridiculous in your own home. When she finished, Celine looked at her for a long moment and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to leave," Amara said. "I want to disappear completely. I want him to have no way to find me or use me or apologize to me." She paused. "And I'm keeping the baby." Celine nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Then let's figure out how." Damien Cross did not sleep that night. He sent the other woman away within 5 minutes of Amara's departure. Gwen, a contact from Lyon, a liaison of the transactional, compartmentalized variety he had told himself didn't count because nothing about it was real, because he had not allowed himself to feel anything about it, because the ability to feel nothing on command had always been his most reliable instrument, and he had mistaken this for control. He stood at the window where Amara had stood when she first saw the city, their first night in the penthouse, 2 years ago. She had pressed her forehead against the glass and said, "It's too much. It's too much for one view. How do people live like this without it making them crazy?" And he had stood behind her and she had leaned back against him and he had thought, briefly, uncharacteristically, "I have everything I want." He tried to call her 4 times. The calls went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message on any of them because there was nothing to say that wasn't inadequate, and inadequacy was not something he had learned to tolerate in himself. He sent her one text at 2 a.m. "I know there's nothing I can say right now. I'm here when you're ready." He read it back and understood that it was a coward's message, one that preserved his dignity by pretending to give her space, that put the responsibility for the next move on her shoulders. He almost deleted it. He sent it anyway. She did not respond. By morning, he had decided she needed time. He had told himself this with the same certainty he applied to strategic decisions, because the alternative, that she did not need time, that she had already decided that there was nothing to wait for, was not a framework he was willing to operate inside. Adrian Vale arrived at the penthouse at 9 a.m. with a briefing file and a cup of coffee, the same way he arrived at the start of every working day. He was 41, lean in the way that men get lean when they've been under pressure for a long time, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that cataloged everything they saw without appearing to. He had been Damien's second for 14 years. He knew the operation better than anyone alive. He knew Damien better than almost anyone. He set the briefing file on the table and looked at Damien's face and said nothing about what he saw there. "Amsterdam problem," he said instead, tapping the file. Reese is getting uncomfortable. He wants a meeting. Schedule it. Damien did not look at the file. Adrian sat down. Everything all right? No. Damien said it simply, without color. Amara left last night. A pause. What do you mean left? I mean she walked out at midnight and she's not answering her phone. Adrian's expression shifted into something carefully neutral. Did something happen? Damien looked at him. Yes. Adrian did not push. This was one of the things about him. He understood when to wait, when pushing would cost more than it gained. He picked up the briefing file and said, "She'll come back. She always comes back." Damien said nothing to this because something about it irritated him in a way he couldn't cleanly articulate, and he had learned not to speak from irritation he couldn't explain. What he didn't know, what he would not know for 4 years, was that in the same moment Adrian Vale was sitting across from him saying she'll come back, Adrian already knew she wouldn't. He had known for 6 hours. He had a contact inside the building's security system. He had watched Amara leave on camera. He had already begun to understand how this could be useful. 3 weeks later, Amara Vane ceased to exist. Not literally, but the woman who had lived in the Geneva penthouse, who had held a Swiss consulting contract and a joint account and a seat at a dinner table across from Damien Cross 4 nights a week. That woman methodically erased every trace she could reach, with Celine's help and a lawyer Celine knew who did not ask certain questions. And she stepped off a flight at JFK on a Tuesday morning in October under her maiden name, Amara Crane. And she stood at the arrivals gate with a rolling suitcase and $4,200 in a bank account and a child growing inside her who did not yet know that its entire world had changed. She told herself she was not running. She told herself this was a decision, not a flight. These things were both true and not true simultaneously, and she was tired enough not to investigate the distinction. New York was expensive and exhausting and did not care at all about her history, which was exactly what she needed. She found a sublet in Flatbush. She found work through a financial consulting firm that needed contractors and didn't ask many questions about the resume gap as long as the technical knowledge was there. And hers was. She built a routine. She built a second routine on top of the first one when Noah arrived. A December baby, small and dark-haired and startlingly alert in the way of babies who seemed to arrive already paying attention. She named him Noah Crane. She did not put a father's name on the birth certificate. She told herself she would explain everything when he was old enough to understand, and she told herself this with the same practiced certainty she used for everything else, because the alternative, that there was no version of this explanation that didn't cost him something, was too large to hold all at once. Noah at 1 was cautious. Noah at 2 was verbal and precise in a way that sometimes made the people at his daycare glance at Amara with raised eyebrows. Noah at 3 had learned to organize his toy cars by color and length with a seriousness that reminded her uncomfortably and piercingly of the way his father organized anything. She did not talk about his father. She did not have to yet. She rebuilt herself. It was not clean or fast or linear. There were months when the consulting work dried up and she took night shifts doing remote bookkeeping for small businesses, months when Noah was sick and she missed deadlines and had to eat those losses professionally. There were nights she lay in the dark of the Flatbush apartment, listening to the sound of the city and feeling the specific loneliness of a woman who has exited one life completely and has not yet finished building the next one. But she did not call Damien Cross. She did not reach out. She did not allow herself to imagine what might be happening on the other side of the Atlantic, whether he was looking, whether he cared enough to look, whether the silence meant he'd moved on so cleanly that it was almost insulting. She had made a decision, and she was going to live in it. Celine was the only person in the world who knew where she was. Celine, who visited twice a year and never mentioned Geneva and brought Noah small, overpriced gifts and sat in the kitchen with Amara after he was asleep and talked about nothing important with the practiced ease of a woman keeping a friend sane. He stopped looking, Celine said one evening. It was Noah's first birthday, almost exactly. Celine had come for the weekend. They were splitting a bottle of wine on the kitchen floor because the couch was buried under wrapping paper. Amara looked at her. You're in contact with people there? Not directly. Through someone who is... Celine paused. He issued one inquiry through his security team, about 6 weeks after you left. Then nothing. Amara absorbed this. She turned her wine glass in her hands. Good, she said. Is it? Yes. She said it flat and final, the way she said things she had already decided she was done examining. It's good. It means he understood. Celine looked at her for a moment with the careful expression she wore when she thought Amara was lying to herself. She didn't say anything. This was one of the things Amara valued about her. What neither of them knew was that Damien's one security inquiry had not been allowed to reach its logical conclusion. That the person inside his organization tasked with running that search had quietly ensured the trail went cold 3 steps before it would have found her. That the stopping of that search was not an accident, but that truth was still 4 years away from the surface. In Geneva, Damien Cross contracted inward the way powerful men do when they lose something they can't replace and refuse to name it. He worked more. He controlled more. He expanded the operation into 2 additional markets and restructured the financial architecture of the entire organization and came out on the other side of 14 months, harder and more precise and more dangerous and hollower in some specific place he had never thought to protect because he had not known it was there until it was empty. Adrian Vale was everywhere in those months. He was the person Damien ate dinner with on the nights the silence in the penthouse became structural rather than atmospheric. He was the person who ran the Amsterdam negotiation when Damien's head wasn't in it. He was the person who sat across from him at the long table in the operations room at midnight and said, with quiet conviction, "She's gone, Damien. People choose to leave. Honoring that is the only thing you can do." And Damien, who was brilliant in almost every room, in almost every context, who could read a man's pressure points in 40 seconds and had never been seriously outmaneuvered in 14 years, believed him. Because Adrian had been right before. Because trust, when it is built slowly and carefully over a long time, becomes a kind of gravity. You stop questioning it because you've stopped noticing it. He thought about Amara. He thought about her less as the months accumulated and then hated himself for thinking about her less because it felt like another failure, another thing he couldn't get right even in the domain of his own grief. He did not know she was in Brooklyn. He did not know about Noah. He did not know that 3 times in those 4 years, Adrian Vale received reports on Amara Crane's location, her income, her building address, her routine, and read them and filed them in a partition on a private server Damien had no access to. He did not know any of this until the morning a medical record arrived on his desk inside a courier envelope marked with a Geneva Clinic's letterhead. A record not addressed to him, a record that had been redirected, a record that had clearly passed through at least 2 sets of hands before reaching his. And he opened it and sat very still for a very long time. The record was a prenatal file. Amara Vane, patient, gestational age at first visit, 8 weeks, date of first visit, the same week she left. He sat with this for 6 minutes. He was a man who had processed terrible information quickly his entire adult life, and he sat with this for 6 minutes before he could make himself move. A child. Her child. Their child. The timing was exact and unmistakable, and he was not a man who required things to be explained twice. He was a father. He had been a father for... He did the arithmetic with brutal mechanical precision, 3 years and 4 months. He stood up from the desk and walked to the window and stood there for another 3 minutes with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set so hard that his back teeth ached. And then he turned around and sat back down and opened his laptop and pulled up every resource at his disposal and began. He found the Flatbush address inside 11 hours. He booked a flight to New York for the following morning. And then, at 10:30 that evening, when he went to tell Adrian what he'd found, because Adrian was the person he told things to, because that was how 14 years of habit worked, he stopped outside Adrian's office door. He stopped because he heard something. Adrian's voice. Adrian on a phone call, speaking low. Damien stood outside the half-open door in the corridor and listened, because something in the cadence of what he was hearing made his instincts, which were old and reliable, and had never once failed him when he actually listened to them, go very, very quiet inside him. The file reached him. Yes. A pause. Earlier than I expected, but it doesn't change the sequence. He'll go to New York. He'll find them. And when he does, the disruption gives us exactly the window we discussed. Another pause. He'll be distracted. He'll be vulnerable. That's when we move. Silence. Damien stood in the corridor and breathed. Every single thing he thought he understood about the last 4 years rearranged itself in approximately 90 seconds. Not in a messy, emotional way. In the clean, cold, precise way of a man who has just understood the architecture of a deception and is already, automatically, numbly, beginning to map the dimensions of it. He walked back to his office without making a sound. He sat down. He closed his laptop. And he began to think about everything Adrian Vale had ever told him about Amara. He did not sleep. This was not new. But this time the sleeplessness had a different quality. It wasn't grief or restlessness. It was the focused, combustible wakefulness of someone who has understood that they are already inside a trap and must figure out, without appearing to notice the trap, how to get out of it. By morning, when he boarded the flight to New York, only 3 people knew he was leaving Geneva. Adrian Vale was not one of them. The city hit him the way it always did. Too loud, too vertical, too much happening at every elevation. He'd been to New York dozens of times for business. He had never been to Brooklyn. He took a car from JFK and sat in traffic on the BQE, watching the borough assemble itself through the window, and tried to imagine, and failed, what the last 4 years of Amara's life had looked like from the inside. He had the address. He had a photograph, recent, pulled from a social profile belonging to her friend Celine, that showed Amara on a street that he now understood was 4 blocks from where she lived. She looked different. Older, yes, but more than that. Something in the way she stood had changed. She looked like a woman who had decided something about herself and was living fully inside that decision. He also had one other photograph, Celine's profile, a holiday post, 14 months ago. Amara in the background, and in front of her a small dark-haired boy looking at the camera with serious eyes. Damien had stared at this photograph for a long time on the plane. The boy's eyes were his. This was not wishful thinking or projection. They were structurally, unmistakably his. The same distance between them, the same particular quality of attention in them. He felt something when he looked at this photograph that he had never felt before and did not have a precise word for. It was not simply love, which he'd felt before, or grief, which he knew well, but something that encompassed both of those and sat beneath them like a geological thing, older and heavier and more permanent. He had a son. His son was 3 years old and had never heard his name. The car stopped on a residential block. He got out. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and looked at the building and thought about all the different ways this could go wrong, and there were many, and he chose to walk toward the door anyway. He rang the buzzer for apartment 4C, 30 seconds. Nothing. He rang again. The intercom crackled. Her voice came through it, cautious, clipped. "Who is it?" Damien Cross pressed the call button and said the only thing he could think of that wasn't a lie. "It's me." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he counted to 8. Then the door buzzed open. And somewhere above him, in an apartment in Brooklyn, the life Amara Crane had spent 4 years building braced itself for impact. The stairwell smelled like old radiator heat and someone's dinner from 2 floors up. Garlic, something fried. And Damien climbed it without hurrying because hurrying would have been the wrong energy for what was waiting at the top. 4th floor. The door to 4C was already open by the time he reached the landing, but only by 6 inches, and Amara was standing in that gap with her hand on the frame and her shoulder against the door, and her whole body arranged in the posture of a woman who has not yet decided whether to let something in or keep it out. She looked at him the way you look at something you've spent a long time preparing to see and still aren't ready for. He looked at her and did not speak first because he understood, with absolute clarity, that the first words in this room needed to be hers. "You have about 30 seconds," she said, "to tell me how you found me before I close this door." Her voice was level. That was what hit him. Not anger, not tears, just the flat, controlled register of a woman who had made decisions about her emotional real estate and was not offering him any of it for free. "Medical record," he said. "Geneva Clinic. Someone redirected it to me." Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of a thing she had already suspected and hoped was wrong. Who? I don't know yet. Don't know or won't say. Don't know. He held her gaze. I came here alone. No team, no advance notice. I took a cab from the airport. He paused. Amara, I know about the baby. The 6 inches of open door did not change. She studied him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had always been able to do what very few people's eyes could do to him, make him feel seen in a way that was slightly uncomfortable, like standing in a room with better lighting than you'd planned for. His name is Noah, she said. The word landed in his chest like something physical. He didn't let it show on his face, but it cost him. Can I come in? She held the door open. He stepped past her into the apartment, and she closed it behind him, and he stood in the entry and looked at the space she had built. It was small and clean and precise, in the way of someone who had learned to make limited space feel intentional rather than cramped. Books on low shelves arranged by height. A child's drawings taped to the wall beside the kitchen. Red and blue crayon shapes. A house. Something that might have been a dog or a bear. It was hard to tell. A pair of small sneakers by the door. Mismatched Velcro, one tongue folded in on itself. He looked at the sneakers for 1 second longer than he meant to. He's not here, Amara said. She moved past him into the kitchen and put the counter between them with the practiced ease of someone who had thought about spatial arrangements in this room and what they meant. He's with a neighbor until 3. Okay. So you have, she checked the clock on the wall, 90 minutes to say whatever you came to say before I need to go get him. And I'm not going to let you meet him today, Damien. I want to be clear about that right now. I'm not asking to. She looked at him like she didn't quite believe that. Then what are you asking? He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table without asking permission and sat down, because standing across from her felt like a posture of confrontation he didn't want. He put his hands on the table, flat, in the open. I'm asking for a conversation. That's it. You can throw me out after. She didn't sit. She stayed at the counter with her arms crossed under her chest and her jaw set. She was wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater, and her hair was shorter than he remembered, pulled back, and she looked tired in a specific way. Not the tiredness of sleeplessness, but the tiredness of someone who has been operating at full load for a long time without backup. He had done that to her. He knew it, and he did not try to move past it quickly. I'm not here to apologize, he said. Her eyebrow moved. No? I mean, I am. I will. I have things to say that are going to sound like apologies because they are. But that's not why I got on a plane. He looked at her steadily. I got on a plane because my son is in this city, and I just found out he exists, and I needed to be in the same city as him. Even if you won't let me near him yet. I needed to be here. Amara looked at him for a long time. Yet, she said. Yes. You're already assuming a yet. I'm hoping for one. He paused. There's a difference. She pulled out the other chair and sat down slowly, like she was doing it against her better judgment. She put her own hands on the table and looked at them, and then looked at him and said, You really don't know who sent the record? No. But I have a suspicion. Who? He was quiet for a second. Adrian. Her expression shifted into something complicated. Why would Adrian send it? That's the part I'm still working out. He watched her face. Did you ever meet him before you left? 3 or 4 times. Functions. He was always, she paused, choosing the word carefully, attentive. The kind of attentive that's actually about information collection. Yes, Damien said. That's exactly right. He told her what he had heard outside Adrian's office door. He told her plainly, without editorializing, the way he reported operational intelligence. Stripped of emotion, sequenced correctly, nothing added or removed. He watched her face change as he spoke, watched the initial skepticism give way to something colder and more alert. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He knew where I was. I think so, for some time. He knew about Noah. Probably. And he sat on it. Her voice had gone very flat. He sat on it for 4 years, and then sent you the record now because it was useful to him now. That's my read. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with her back to him and her arms still crossed. Outside, the street sounds of Brooklyn moved through the glass, muffled, ordinary. A truck, kids, someone's car stereo cutting out. The absolute normalcy of it felt like a different language from the conversation happening in this room. I need you to understand something, she said, without turning around. I didn't leave because of the affair. Or not only because of it. She paused. I left because I was pregnant and I was standing in that penthouse, and I understood clearly, maybe for the first time, that there was no version of that life that was safe for a child. That there was no wall I could build between your world and a baby who deserved better than to grow up in a house where danger was just the weather. I know. Don't say I know like it's easy. It's not easy. His voice was quiet. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying I understand it. I understand the decision even if the way it played out. He stopped. Even if it cost me something I can't get back. She turned around. Her eyes were dry and direct. It cost Noah something too. You know that. Yes. He's going to ask, eventually, about his father. I've been preparing for that conversation for 2 years, trying to figure out how to tell a 4-year-old something that a 40-year-old couldn't fully explain. She looked at him. So whatever you came here for, whatever happens next, I need to know that you understand the damage isn't just between you and me. He's in it too, and he didn't choose to be. Damien sat with that. He did not try to deflect it or soften it. He let it be exactly as heavy as it was. I understand that, he said, and I'm not here to take anything from you or disrupt what you've built. I'm here because he's my son, and because you deserve to know that the situation in Geneva may not be as over as you thought. She went still. What does that mean? It means Adrian Vale knew where you were and chose when and how to make me find out. It means he's using you, using Noah, as a variable in something I don't have the full map of yet. And it means... Damien stopped, and something crossed his face that was the closest he'd come to showing her what this was actually costing him. It means you might not be as safe here as you thought you were. The room went very quiet. Amara looked at him with the controlled, calibrated expression she used when she was frightened and refusing to perform it. He knew that expression. He had seen it exactly once before, 3 years into their marriage, when a threat had come close enough to be real, and she had stood in their kitchen and looked at him exactly this way and said, "Tell me the truth, all of it. I can handle the truth. I cannot handle being managed." "How not safe?" she said. "I don't know yet. That's honest. I don't know the shape of what he's building or what role having leverage on me plays in it. But I know Adrian doesn't do anything without a function. He doesn't keep a file on your location for 4 years out of idle curiosity. He was watching us." "Yes." She breathed in through her nose slowly. "Noah, I don't think there's an immediate threat, but I don't want to tell you something I'm not certain of." He leaned forward slightly. "I need 2 days. I need to go back to Geneva and understand what's actually happening before I can tell you how much of this you need to worry about. But I needed to tell you it existed first. I needed you to know. And in the meantime," her voice was very controlled, "I'm supposed to do what? Take Noah and go where? Nowhere is better than here. I built this here. You don't have to go anywhere right now." He held up a hand. "I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to be careful and to trust me for 48 hours. The word trust detonated in the room like something she had to physically manage. "Trust you," she said. "I know what I'm asking. Do you?" She looked at him with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, something that had been composting in a quiet place for 4 years and had turned into something denser and less volatile than either. "The last time I trusted you, I was standing in a clinic being told I was pregnant and planning how I was going to tell my husband and coming home to find out that the man I'd trusted had been..." She stopped, rerouted. "No, I'm not doing that. That's not the useful conversation right now." "You're right," he said. "It's not. The useful conversation is about Noah and about what happens in the next 48 hours and about what Adrian Vale is actually doing." He paused. "But I'm not going to pretend that the other thing doesn't exist. I'm not going to sit in your kitchen and ask you to act like the reason you're here in Brooklyn instead of Geneva isn't directly related to what I did." She looked at him. "So say it," she said, "if you're going to say it." "What I did was a betrayal. It was a specific conscious act of damage against the person in my life I should have protected most carefully. I have no explanation for it that functions as an excuse. I was absent from our marriage in every way that mattered, and I made a choice that was selfish and destructive. And the fact that I've spent 4 years knowing exactly what it cost does not change what it was." He held her gaze through all of it. "I'm sorry, Amara, for what I did and for what it made you have to do, and for the 4 years that Noah has existed in a world where I wasn't there." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a siren passed somewhere on Atlantic Avenue and faded. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the wall with the crayon drawings. She looked back at him. "I need you to leave before 3, she said. "Okay. And I need you to not come back without calling first. Okay? And if you go back to Geneva and figure out what Adrian is doing, I need you to tell me everything. Not a curated version, everything, even if it's bad." "Yes." She stood up. The conversation was over. Not resolved, not healed, not anywhere close to either, but over for now in the way of a room where two people have said the real things and need to not be in the same space anymore before it becomes something else. He stood up too. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped and looked at the crayon drawings on the wall again, at the small sneakers with the mismatched Velcro. "What color is his hair?" he said. He hadn't planned to ask it. It came out anyway. Amara looked at him for a second. "Dark," she said. "Same as yours." He nodded. He left. He did not go back to the hotel immediately. He walked. This was not something Damien Cross did habitually, walking without purpose, moving through a city without a destination, but he walked through the November cold of Brooklyn for 45 minutes, through neighborhoods that had no idea who he was, past bodegas and laundromats and a school letting out early, kids pouring through the gate in coats that were too thin for the weather, running toward nothing in particular with the total purposeful joy of children who are not yet afraid of open space. He was thinking about Adrian. 14 years. He ran the architecture of it backward, looking for the load-bearing places, the points where the structure of trust had been not just maintained but actively constructed. The Amsterdam situation, 3 years ago, when Adrian had run the negotiation so cleanly that Damien had come away thinking, he could run the whole operation. I could hand it to him. The year before that, the Brussels restructure, Adrian's idea, Adrian's execution, result that strengthened Damien's position in 3 markets simultaneously. The patient, competent, loyal accumulation of 14 years of good decisions that had made Damien's regard for him feel like something earned and solid. The perfect record of a man who intended to be trusted completely. He thought about the inquiry, the one security search he had launched for Amara 6 weeks after she disappeared, the one that had gone cold 3 steps before it should have. At the time, he had taken this as confirmation that she had covered her tracks well, and he had decided, with Adrian's encouragement, he now understood, that pushing further would be a violation of whatever boundary she was trying to establish. He had not pushed further. Adrian had made sure of it. He stopped on a corner and looked at the street sign without reading it. A woman walked past him with a stroller, not looking at him, the way people in New York didn't look at each other. He thought about the phrase Adrian had used on the phone. The disruption gives us exactly the window we discussed. The plural. The window we discussed. Which meant there were other people. Which meant this wasn't Adrian improvising around an opportunity, but executing against a plan that had been built with others, over time, with intention. Damien was not afraid of Adrian Vale. He had never been afraid of him. But he understood, standing on a corner in Brooklyn in the November cold, that he had made a category error. He had evaluated Adrian as a subordinate for 14 years, and had never once evaluated him as an adversary. And those were completely different analyses that produced completely different pictures. He took out his phone and called the one number he trusted without qualification. 2 rings. A voice, female, slightly hoarse. "It's been 6 months. I know, Mira. I need something. Mira Voss was 63 years old and lived in Lausanne and had spent 30 years working for 3 different intelligence apparatuses before deciding she'd rather consult privately for people she personally found interesting. Damien had been on her shortlist for 9 years. She charged aggressively and delivered completely. "What kind of something?" she said. "Surveillance audit. Someone inside my operation has been running a side file for possibly 4 years. I need to know the scope of it. I need to know who he's been talking to, what the financial movements look like, and—" He paused. "I need it done without him knowing it's happening. How much time do I have?" 48 hours. A brief silence. "Damien." "I know. You'll owe me extravagantly." "I always do." He paused. "The name is Adrian Vale. You have his profile from the Reese documentation 2 years ago." "I remember him." A beat. "He was the one you trusted completely." "Yes. The ones you trust completely are always the most expensive surprise." She didn't say it unkindly. It was simply the kind of thing she knew from decades of watching people operate. "I'll start tonight. Stay out of Geneva until I have something." He hung up and stood on the corner for another moment and then began walking back toward the hotel, and he thought about Noah the entire way. About dark hair and serious eyes and a small sneaker with the Velcro folded in on itself. And the cold that pressed through his jacket felt like the right kind of thing to feel. 26 hours later, Mira called him back. He was sitting in the hotel room with the curtains open and the city's noise moving through the glass and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He picked up on the first ring. "It's bigger than you thought," she said. He had known she was going to say this. He had been braced for it for 26 hours. Still, the weight of it landed differently than bracing could account for. "Tell me." The side file on Amara Crane goes back 4 years, 2 months. Regular position updates, income data, building security patterns. Not deep surveillance. He wasn't running a team on the ground, but enough to know where she was and whether she was reachable. Reachable as in useful. If he needed her to be. Mira paused. There are also 6 months of communications with a man named Soren Block. You know that name? Damien's jaw tightened. He runs the Hartman Group, Eastern European assets primarily. Block and Vale have been in conversation about a transfer of operational control. The framing in the communications is, and there's a lot of them, Damien, they weren't being particularly careful with encryption, which is itself a signal, is that Block comes in as a financial partner, Vale takes operational command, and the existing structure gets rebranded under a holding entity that's clean enough to survive a legal review. They want to take it legitimate. They want to take the profitable parts legitimate and disappear the rest into Block's existing infrastructure. Vale gets a CEO position in something that looks respectable. Block gets your network at a fraction of the build cost. She paused. And you get pushed out cleanly. The plan isn't to destroy you, it's to make you redundant, which is in some ways more insulting. Damien was quiet for a moment. What's my leverage point? The transfer of control requires your signature on 3 instruments. Vale can't legally execute without it. His plan, as best I can reconstruct it from the communication trail, is to create a moment of, his word, not mine, emotional incapacitation significant enough that you either sign something you don't fully read, or you're discredited sufficiently that a proxy signature can be argued as your intent. The sun, Damien said. The sun, Mir confirmed, or more precisely, the discovery of the sun, and what comes after it. He expected the revelation to destabilize you. He expected you to go to New York and make a mess of it. Emotional confrontation, possible public incident, things that could be used. He's been very patient about this. He didn't send you that file until the timing was right for him. Damien looked at the cold coffee on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. Is there a team on the ground here? He said. In New York. A short pause. 1 person, freelance. Name is Jules Carver, based out of Toronto, does periodic work for Block's network. She arrived in New York 36 hours ago. Mira's voice went careful. She's been in the vicinity of a residential address in Flatbush for the last 16 hours. The cold in Damien's chest was not the same as the cold of the room. "Give me the address she's been surveilling," he said, though he already knew. Mira gave it to him. It was Amara's building. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, jacket already off the chair, phone pressed to his ear, moving toward the door with the specific controlled urgency of a man who has spent his entire adult life making decisions under pressure and is currently making the most important one of all of them. "Mira, I need 2 more things. Go. I need everything you have on Carver sent to my phone in the next 10 minutes. And I need you to start building the legal mechanism to freeze every financial instrument Adrian has touched in the last 18 months. He was in the elevator. "Can you do that?" "The freeze is doable. It'll take longer than 10 minutes. "How long?" 6 hours if I push it." "Push it." He stepped out into the lobby. "And Mira, thank you." "Don't thank me. Just don't let him win. I find it aesthetically offensive when the patient ones win." He was through the hotel doors and into the street and moving. Amara did not pick up on the first call. He called again immediately. On the third call, she picked up and said, in the voice of a woman who had been interrupted in the middle of something, "Damien, I said to call before There's a woman outside your building," he said. "She's been there since yesterday. Her name is Jules Carver. I need you to take Noah and go somewhere else right now. Don't use the front door." Silence. Then, "How long have you known?" 20 minutes. "Is she—" "She's surveillance, not a direct threat. Not yet. But I'm not willing to wait to find out what the threshold is." He was in a cab already, door barely closed, giving the driver the cross streets. "Is there a back exit from your building?" "There's a service entrance on the ground floor. It opens onto—" "Don't tell me on the phone. Just use it. Call your neighbor, the one who watches Noah. Don't tell her why. Take him somewhere public and crowded and call me from there." Another silence. Shorter this time. "Okay. Amara." "What?" "I'm sorry. I'm handling it. But right now I need you to move." He heard her already moving. The sounds of the apartment, a drawer, her keys. And underneath those sounds, for just a second, he heard something else. A child's voice, faint, questioning, from another room. A small voice asking something in the particular tone of a child who has heard the adult urgency in the air and wants to know what it means. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. The cab moved through Brooklyn and Damien Cross sat in the back of it, with his hands on his knees, and he thought about 4 years and the architecture of a betrayal built so carefully and over such a long time that it had looked from every angle exactly like loyalty. And he thought about the moment in the corridor outside Adrian's office when everything had rearranged itself in 90 seconds. And he thought about the small voice from the other room and what it would cost, what it had already cost, what it was still costing. And he made a decision that had been building without his knowledge for 4 years and arrived now fully formed and absolute. He was going to end this. Not just Adrian, not just the takeover, all of it, the entire structure, the whole empire. The 14 years of architecture that had consumed his marriage and stolen his son's first 3 years, and handed Adrian Vale a weapon so effective he hadn't even needed to forge it. Damien had built it himself, out of absence and choices, and the slow, terrible decision to be more available to power than to the people who needed him. He was going to tear it down. But first he needed to find Jules Carver and make sure she understood, clearly and without room for misinterpretation, that the people in that apartment in Flatbush were no longer leverage. They were protected, and the man protecting them had nothing left to lose. The cab stopped at the corner of Amara's block, and Damien Cross got out into the November cold and looked up the street and spotted the woman in the gray coat standing near the building entrance with a coffee cup she hadn't touched in too long, and she looked up and saw him at the same moment, and in the second that their eyes met across the width of a Brooklyn street, both of them understood that the situation had just changed completely. She reached for her phone. He was already walking toward her. Jules Carver did not run. That was the first thing Damien clocked as he moved up the block toward her. She didn't bolt, didn't duck into a doorway, didn't do any of the things an amateur would do when they realized they'd been made. She stood her ground with the coffee cup still in her hand and watched him come with the flat, assessing expression of a professional who has already run the math and knows that running changes the calculation against her. She was mid-40s, compact, with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm but was its functional equivalent. Gray coat, dark scarf, sensible shoes. She looked like someone's accountant. This was probably intentional. He stopped 4 feet from her. "You're Damien Cross," she said. Not a question. "And you've been standing outside this building for 16 hours, he said. "Which means you're either very bad at surveillance or very comfortable with being seen." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "I was told you were smart." "By Adrian." She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. "What do you want, Mr. Cross?" "I want you to understand that the people in that building are no longer useful to whoever sent you here. Whatever leverage they were supposed to represent." He paused. "It's been removed from the equation." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." "I know. If you were, you'd have done it. You've had 16 hours. He held her gaze. "You're here to watch, to report, to tell Adrian when I showed up and what I did when I got here." He tilted his head slightly. "So, what are you going to tell him?" A beat. Then, "That you were here, that you spoke to the woman." She glanced up at the building briefly, reflexively. "That you seemed—" She chose the word with a precision that told him she was more than a watcher, prepared. "Good," he said. "Tell him that. Tell him I seemed prepared." He took 1 step back, giving her room that wasn't a threat. "And tell him I'll be back in Geneva by tomorrow morning." He turned and walked back the way he came, and did not look back to see if she watched him go because he already knew she did. His phone was in his hand before he reached the corner. He called Amara. She picked up on the second ring. Background noise, an indoor space, voices, the clatter of a place that served food. She'd gotten Noah out. She'd done it fast. He felt something in his chest relax by approximately 2 degrees. "Are you somewhere safe?" he said. "A diner on Fulton." Her voice was tight. "Noah thinks it's an adventure. He asked if we're hiding from a monster." A pause. I didn't know what to say to that. Damien closed his eyes for 1 second. "You're not hiding from a monster," he said. "You're being cautious because I asked you to be. The immediate situation is, the woman outside your building is surveillance, not a threat. She won't approach you." "How do you know?" "Because I just talked to her." Silence. "You talked to her?" "Yes." "That's your version of handling something quietly." "I'm going to Geneva tonight," he said, moving past it. "I have someone running a financial audit on Adrian's moves. By the time I get there, I'll have enough to act on." He stopped on the corner and looked at the street. "I need you to stay somewhere other than your apartment for the next 24 hours. Is there somewhere you can take Noah that isn't your building and isn't Celine's, somewhere Adrian doesn't have a file on?" A longer pause. He could hear her thinking, hear the specific quality of her silence when she was making a practical decision rather than an emotional one. "There's a woman I work with, Diane. We're not close enough that anyone would connect us. She has a spare room." "Yes. Go there. Don't use your bank card for anything tonight. Use cash." He paused. I know how to disappear, Damien." Her voice was flat. "I've done it once already." The sentence landed cleanly. He accepted it. "I'll call you when I have something concrete. 24 hours. "And if you don't call in 24 hours? "Then something went wrong. And there's a number I'm going to text you. Mira Voss, Lausanne. You call her, and she'll handle it." A beat. "Who is she?" "Someone who owes me less than I owe her, which means she's motivated." He paused. "Amara, He stopped. Started again. "Keep him close tonight." There was a silence on the line that had texture to it. "I always do," she said, and hung up. Ma'am. He was on a flight to Geneva at 9:47 that evening. Business class, window seat, and he didn't sleep for a single minute of the 7 hours because he spent all of them building the approach in his head. Not just to Adrian, but to the structure underneath Adrian. The network of relationships and financial instruments and operational dependencies that would need to be addressed in sequence, in the right order, or the whole thing would twist in ways he couldn't predict. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The chess of it, the long sequence of moves calculated simultaneously, The ability to hold 12 variables in his head and track how each one changed the weight of all the others. It was the thing that had built the empire. It was the thing he was now going to use to take it apart. By the time the plane began its descent into Geneva, he had the sequence mapped to 7 steps. He had also identified, with the cold specificity of a man who has had 7 hours and no distractions, the weakest point in Adrian's plan. The 3 instruments that required Damien's signature weren't just a legal formality, they were the entire load-bearing structure of Adrian's exit strategy. Without them, Block couldn't move in. Without Block's capital, Adrian couldn't execute the rebrand. Without the rebrand, the whole transfer of control collapsed into an illegal coup with no cover and no financial infrastructure, which meant Adrian would be left standing in Damien's organization, having declared himself its leader with nothing to back the declaration up. The signature was the hinge, which meant Adrian needed to get Damien to sign something before Damien understood what he was signing. Or Adrian needed Damien removed from the equation entirely, in a way that could be argued as voluntary or incapacitating before the instruments could be executed by proxy. Neither of those things was going to happen. But as the plane touched down on the tarmac and the morning light of Geneva came through the window at a low gray angle, Damien felt the first thread of something he hadn't accounted for start pulling at the edge of his thinking. A small irritant, the kind of thing a careful mind registers before it can name it. Something Mira had said. He turned it over. He wasn't being particularly careful with encryption, which is itself a signal. A man like Adrian Vale. 14 years of flawless operational security. 6 months of communications with Soren Block stored in a partition that Mira, very good but not uniquely good, had accessed in under 26 hours. Why would Adrian be careless? He was still turning this question over when he walked through the airport and into the sharp cold of the Geneva morning, and he was turning it over when his phone buzzed with a message from Mira. Call me before you go to the office. And he stopped on the pavement outside Arrivals and called her immediately. She picked up without preamble. Something's changed. Tell me. The communications I found, the Block negotiations, all of it. I did a second pass at 4 a.m. A pause that had weight in it. The encryption they used is a protocol I recognize. It's one used by a specific firm out of Vienna that works, among other clients, for your organization's legal compliance department. Damien stood very still. My compliance department. Yes. Which means one of 2 things. Either Vale used your own firm's infrastructure for his private communications, sloppy and arrogant, or someone in my compliance department is involved, Damien said. Or, Mira said, and her voice shifted into the particular register she used when she was about to say something she didn't like saying. The communications were planted there, in that partition, using your firm's protocol to ensure that whoever audited them, whoever you sent to look, would find them in a way that felt credible. The morning air moved around him, and he stood in it and let the sentence fully arrive. You're saying the file on Adrian might be constructed, he said. I'm saying the trail is cleaner than it should be if it were real. Real people making real plans over 6 months generate noise, inconsistencies, redundancies. What I found is coherent, purposeful. The way a document is purposeful, not the way a conversation is. She paused. I'm not saying Adrian is clean. I'm saying I'm not certain the evidence I found is what it appears to be. Damien turned this over in his head for 10 seconds. If the file is planted, who planted it, and why? Those are the questions. Another pause. The why I can speculate on. If someone wanted you to move against Adrian Tapois, preemptively, aggressively, before you had full information, feeding you a plausible evidence trail would be an efficient way to make that happen. You go at Adrian hard. You damage your own organization from the inside. You create exactly the instability that... She stopped. That actually benefits Block, Damien said. Or someone operating parallel to Block. Or someone whose interests are served by you destroying your own second-in-command based on manufactured intelligence. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be clear. This is a possibility, not a conclusion. The file might be real, but I am not comfortable telling you to act on it as if I'm certain. Damien stood on the pavement outside Geneva Airport in the gray morning and thought about the corridor outside Adrian's office, the phone call he had heard, the plural, we. The window they had discussed. He had been certain. Standing in that corridor at 11:30 at night, he had been absolutely certain of what he was hearing and what it meant. Now he stood in the cold with the certainty pulling loose at the edges and something worse taking its place. Not doubt exactly, but the recognition that he had been moving fast, making decisions on compressed timelines in an emotionally disrupted state, which was precisely the condition under which a careful adversary would want him operating. Mira, is there any way to verify the source, to know whether the file is real or planted? There's one way. The block communications reference 3 in-person meetings, specific locations, specific dates. If Vale was actually at those locations on those dates, the communications are likely real. If he wasn't, she stopped. I have the dates and locations. I can run travel records, hotel registrations, security footage, if I can access the right systems. But that's another 12 to 18 hours. Start it, he said immediately. And in the meantime, don't freeze the financial instruments. Not yet. A short pause. All right. He could hear her recalibrating. Be careful about what you walk into today. I'm always careful. You're usually careful, she said, and hung up. But he went to the penthouse first, rather than the office. He needed a shower and a change of clothes and 30 minutes of silence in which to adjust the shape of everything he thought he understood. The penthouse was the way it always was. Immaculate, maintained by the building's service, cold in the specific way of a space where no one actually lived anymore. He stood under the shower for longer than he needed to and thought about the question that Mira hadn't said, but that was now structuring everything. If the evidence against Adrian was planted, who had access to plant it? Who would know to use his compliance department's encryption protocol? Who would know to feed a medical record, the Geneva Clinic file, into a courier envelope addressed to redirect to Damien's desk? Who would know that this specific revelation, at this specific moment, would send Damien to New York in an emotional state optimal for disruption? Someone inside the organization. Someone with deep access and detailed knowledge of how Damien thought and what he cared about. Someone who had been close enough for long enough to understand that the discovery of a son was the exact instrument required to move Damien out of his usual patterns of careful deliberation. He was standing at the closet pulling on a clean shirt when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Adrian Vale. He picked up. "You're back," Adrian said. His voice was completely normal. This was either the voice of an innocent man or the voice of a man who was exceptionally good, and Damien could no longer tell which. "Just landed," Damien said. "I need to meet." "I know. I've been expecting it." A beat. "Come to the office. There's something you need to see." The phrasing landed oddly. There's something you need to see. Not "we need to talk" or "I heard you went to New York" or any of the responses that would fit the range of what Adrian might or might not know. There's something you need to see. "I'll be there in an hour," Damien said. He hung up and stood in the bedroom with the shirt half-buttoned and thought about the 11 seconds in front of the elevator 4 years ago, when Amara had stood waiting for the doors to open and the world had been arranged one way, and then the doors had opened and she had stepped inside, and when they closed, everything had been arranged differently. He had the same feeling now, the specific sensation of a threshold. He finished buttoning the shirt. He picked up his jacket. He went. The operations building was 8 minutes from the penthouse, a converted commercial space in the Eaux Vives quarter, mid-century structure with good bones and an unremarkable exterior that did not announce what happened inside it. Damien had chosen it for this reason. He had chosen everything about the organization's physical presence for its unremarkability. He walked through the ground floor and nodded at the 2 people he passed and took the stairs to the second floor and stopped outside Adrian's office. The door was open. Adrian was sitting at the long table rather than his desk, not his usual position, and there were papers laid out in front of him, organized and deliberate, and he looked up when Damien appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been waiting and is neither anxious about the wait nor grateful it's over. Across the table from Adrian, in the chair that faced the door, sat Soren Block. Damien stopped in the doorway. Block was 60 years old, silver-haired, with the settled confidence of a man who has moved money across borders for long enough that the money has started to feel like weather. just a thing that moves impersonally in whatever direction the conditions favor. He had a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked at Damien with the mild, assessing expression of someone attending a meeting he had helped arrange. "Damien," Adrian said, "sit down." The quality of those two words, the instruction in them, the authority they assumed, was something Damien filed away with precise, cold attention. Adrian had never said sit down to him. In 14 years, Adrian had never once used that register with him. "You brought Block here," Damien said from the doorway. He didn't go in yet. "I brought him because the conversation we're about to have requires his presence." Adrian's voice was even, completely even. "I know you went to New York. I know you found Amara and the boy. And I know," he paused, "that you've been running an investigation into my activities through Mafia Boss." The room was very quiet. Block looked at his water glass. Damien looked at Adrian and understood with a clarity that arrived fully formed and cold as the Geneva air that the past 48 hours had not unfolded the way he had believed they were unfolding. That the sequence of events, the medical record, Jules Carver outside Amara's building, the planted file that Mira had flagged, this meeting, had been constructed around a logic he had not been reading correctly. "Mira has a leak," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mira has a liability," Adrian said, and something in his voice shifted, not to cruelty, but to the particular register of a man who has stopped performing. "She's been working for 3 clients simultaneously for the past 8 months. One of those clients has been us." A small pause. "Everything she found, everything she told you. We knew what she was finding before she told you. We adjusted accordingly." The floor of Damien's thinking dropped out by approximately 6 inches. He had sent Mira in. He had trusted her without question, 9 years of reliable work, and every piece of intelligence she had delivered. The planted file, the flag about the encryption, the suggestion that the evidence might not be real, the instruction to hold off on freezing the financial instruments, had been managed, fed to him in a sequence designed to produce a specific outcome. He had not frozen the financial instruments. He looked at the papers on the table. "Those are the 3 instruments," he said. "Yes." Adrian looked at him steadily. "And I want to explain something to you before this goes any further, because I think you deserve the explanation even if you're not going to like it." He paused. "This was never about taking your empire, Damien. It was about transforming it. You've been running an operation that is 1 bad year away from collapse. Regulatory pressure in 4 markets, a Brussels investigation that's 18 months from becoming public, 2 senior contacts who are cooperating with authorities in ways you are not yet aware of. I have known about all of this for over a year. I have been working on an alternative because the current structure is not survivable." He glanced at Block briefly. "Soren's involvement gives us a legal architecture that can absorb the transition, a restructure, not a theft, a survival plan." The words were reasonable. The words were delivered with the calm, evidenced conviction of a man who had been rehearsing them. And Damien looked at Adrian Vale's face and heard every word and registered them completely, and also registered, underneath them, the immovable truth, that none of this had been done with his knowledge or consent, that the investigation, the leverage, the manipulation of the medical record, the surveillance of his son, none of it had been offered to him as a partner. It had been done to him as a subject. "You use my son," Damien said. Adrian's jaw tightened, the first crack in the evenness. "I used the situation, not your son. You sent Jules Carver to stand outside a building where my child lives." Damien's voice had gone to a place that was very quiet and very cold, the place it went when the anger was deep enough that heat was no longer its primary expression. "You kept a surveillance file on his mother for 4 years. You sat in my penthouse and told me she was gone, and that respecting her choice meant leaving her alone. And you said that knowing exactly where she was and exactly who she was with and exactly what she had named our son." Something in Adrian's face moved, just slightly. "You sat across from me," Damien said, "for 4 years, and you let me believe I was making a choice. To let her go, to respect what she wanted." A pause. "And you took that from me. You took 4 years of that from me and filed it on a server and used it when it was useful to you." The room was very quiet. Block had not moved or spoken. He was watching the way you watch something that determines which way you step next. Adrian said, I needed you reachable, emotionally reachable. You had shut everything down, Damien. You were operating like a machine. The restructure required you to be willing to step back, and I knew you wouldn't do it voluntarily while you still believed the Empire was the only thing you had. He paused. The sun was... Yes, it was a lever. I'm not pretending it wasn't. But the plan it serves is legitimate, and it is the only plan that gets you out of this organization before it collapses around you. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the 3 instruments on the table. Then he said, How long have you had access to Mira? 8 months. Which means everything she told me this morning was managed, yes. Adrian's voice was careful, including the flag about the planted evidence. You were supposed to sit with uncertainty long enough to come in here without your defenses fully assembled. He paused. I didn't expect you to arrive looking like this. Like what? Like a man who's already decided something. Damien looked at him. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Soren Block, who had built enough legal infrastructure in his 60 years to restructure a small country, and who was sitting here in Geneva at Adrian Vale's invitation because he believed this meeting was going to produce 3 signatures. And then Damien reached into his jacket pocket and placed his own phone on the table, face up, screen active, and they all looked at it. And on the screen was an active call, 43 minutes in progress, routed through a scrambled line to a number in Brussels. I called the regulatory authority contact before I came in, Damien said. The Brussels investigation you mentioned, the one that's 18 months from going public. I accelerated that timeline this morning. They've been listening to this conversation for the past 6 minutes. The silence that followed was total. Adrian's face went through 3 changes in approximately 4 seconds. Damien watched all 3 of them. Block pushed back from the table. Additionally, Damien said, still in the same quiet voice, Mira Voss has been working for me exclusively for 9 years. She has never had 3 simultaneous clients. What she told you this morning about telling me things, that was managed too. He paused. You're not the only one who plans multiple moves in advance. Adrian stood up from the table. His chair scraped back. For one moment, one single moment, the 14 years of composed, strategic, carefully maintained exterior dropped completely, and what was underneath it was raw and complex and not entirely what Damien had expected. Not just ambition, something that looked in the brief, unguarded second before Adrian reassembled himself very much like desperation. You're going to let them take everything, Adrian said. His voice had changed. You're going to hand it to Brussels and walk away, and everything we built, everything I built, Damien said quietly, which is the part you never quite managed to account for, that I built it and I can choose what happens to it. He looked at him steadily. The Brussels contact isn't going to destroy you. I haven't given them your name. I've given them the financial architecture. What can be dissolved legally, dissolved. What can't? He paused. That's what the conversation this morning was actually about. Block stood up, slowly, with the measured movement of a man recalculating. Mr. Cross, you should leave, Damien said to him, without looking at him. Whatever Adrian told you about this meeting, the outcome he described is not the one that's available. He paused. You can reach my legal team through the standard contact if you want to discuss a legitimate consultation arrangement, but not today. Block looked at Adrian. Adrian said nothing. Block picked up his jacket and left, and the sound of his footsteps on the stairs was the only thing in the room for a long moment. Adrian stood at the far end of the table and looked at Damien with an expression that had given up on strategy and arrived at something human and therefore much harder to read. What happens now? He said. Now, Damien said. You're going to sit down and tell me everything, not the version you rehearsed for this meeting. Everything. The Brussels contacts who are cooperating, the regulatory timeline, the specific exposure points, everything you know that I don't. He paused. Because if what you told me is true, that the organization is 1 bad year from collapse, then I need the complete picture to make decisions about how to end it cleanly. And you're going to give me that picture because it's the only thing you have left to offer me. Adrian stood for a moment. He looked at the phone on the table, still active, the Brussels call still running. He looked at the papers, the three unsigned instruments. He looked at Damien's face, and then he sat back down, because he had nowhere else to go. And as Adrian began to speak, slowly at first, and then with the gathering speed of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down, Damien sat across from him and listened and built the picture piece by piece of exactly how damaged the structure beneath his feet actually was. It was worse than he had thought. It was significantly, structurally, irreversibly worse. And in the middle of Adrian's account, Damien's phone buzzed with a message from a New York number. Amara, from a phone he didn't recognize, 3 words. Noah is asking. He looked at those 3 words for 1 second. He put the phone face down on the table and looked back at Adrian and said, "Keep going." But the 3 words sat underneath everything else in the room, like a frequency only he could hear, and they changed the weight of all of it. The empire, the collapse, the Brussels exposure, the 14 years, into something that was finally, for the first time, the right size relative to everything else. Adrian talked for 2 hours and 19 minutes. Damien did not interrupt him once. He sat at the long table with his hands flat on the surface and his face composed into the particular stillness he used in rooms where showing anything would cost him. And he listened to 14 years of an organization he had built get taken apart in real time by the man who knew it best. Every pressure point, every exposure, every relationship that had quietly inverted from asset to liability while Damien had been looking at the parts that were still working. The Brussels investigation was the spine of it. A senior compliance officer inside a Luxembourg banking partner had been cooperating with EU financial crime investigators for 11 months. The information he was providing covered 3 years of transaction architecture, shell structures, routing chains, timing patterns, that would be sufficient when the investigation went public to trigger asset freezes across 4 markets simultaneously. Adrian had known about the cooperating witness for 8 months. He had not told Damien because telling Damien would have triggered an immediate aggressive response, and Adrian's assessment, delivered now in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had stopped managing the narrative, was that an aggressive response would have accelerated the timeline and eliminated the window for a controlled exit. "You were going to manage me out," Damien said when Adrian finished. "Clean hands, legal restructure, blocks money as the cushion. And I was supposed to, what? Take a consulting arrangement and a payout and believe it was a favor. I was going to give you a way out that didn't end with you in front of a Brussels court." Adrian looked at him across the table. He looked tired in a way that wasn't performance. The specific tiredness of someone who has been holding something together through effort of will for a long time and has just let go of it. "That's what it was. You can call it a manipulation if you want." "It is a manipulation." "Yes?" He didn't argue it. "It is. And I should have come to you directly 14 months ago when I first understood how bad the exposure was." He paused. "I didn't because I didn't think you'd listen. I thought you'd fight it. I thought the empire was the only thing you believed in anymore, and you'd rather burn inside it than walk away from it." He looked at Damien's hands, flat on the table. "I was wrong about that." "You were wrong about a lot of things." "Yes." The Brussels call had ended 40 minutes into Adrian's account. Damien had reached over and ended it without explanation, and Adrian had not asked about it, which either meant Adrian had already understood it wasn't real, or had decided it didn't matter anymore. Damien wasn't certain which, and had decided to let it be uncertain. What mattered was the information, and the information was real. He could verify the specifics, the dates, the names, and every instinct he had said they would verify cleanly. He stood up from the table. "I need 4 hours," he said. "Don't go anywhere." Adrian looked up at him. "Where would I go?" Damien picked up his phone and walked out of the office and down the stairs and out into the Eau Vive street, and the cold hit him like a wall, and he stood in it for a moment and breathed. His phone showed 14 missed calls. 12 of them were from a number he didn't recognize, the temporary phone Amara was using. 1 was from a legal contact in Brussels. 1 was from a number he recognized as belonging to the Luxembourg banking partner's internal security team. The Luxembourg call had come in 40 minutes ago. He called it back. 3 rings. A man picked up, guarded. Yes. This is Damien Cross returning your call. A pause. The pause of someone deciding how to say something they've been sitting with. Mr. Cross, I'm calling because we have a situation that developed approximately 2 hours ago that you need to be aware of. Another pause. One of our senior officers, the individual who has been cooperating with the Brussels investigation, was found dead in his apartment this morning. Initial assessment is cardiac, but the circumstances are, a careful hesitation, being reviewed. Damien stood on the pavement and felt the temperature of the situation change completely. Who knows about this, he said. At this stage, local authorities, our internal team, and now you. The Brussels investigators have not been notified yet. The man's voice was strained. Mr. Cross, I want to be direct with you. This individual's cooperation was not known to anyone outside a very small circle. If his death is not natural, and I am not saying it isn't, then someone inside that circle communicated his identity to a party capable of acting on it. And the timing relative to events in Geneva today, I understand, Damien said. He hung up and stood on the pavement and ran the calculation. The cooperating witness was dead. The Brussels investigation's primary source was gone, which meant the timeline for the investigation, the 18-month window Adrian had described, had just become unpredictable. Investigations lost their primary sources and either collapsed or pivoted, and the pivot was usually wider and more aggressive than the original approach, because investigators who lost witnesses started looking harder at everything adjacent to the gap, which meant the 4-market asset freeze wasn't 18 months away anymore. It could be 6. It could be 3. It could, depending on what Brussels had already documented independently of the witness, be triggered in days. And somewhere in the logic of this, a person had decided that a human being in Luxembourg should stop existing because it was operationally convenient. Damien stood with this. He stood with it the way you stand with something that is very heavy and very wrong, and that has your name on it at some remove. And he felt the specific nauseating weight of being the person at the center of a structure that produced this kind of outcome, even when you hadn't ordered it, even when you wouldn't have ordered it, because structures like his developed their own gravity and eventually things fell into it without being pushed. He had built this. He had built something that killed people as a byproduct of its own self-preservation, and the fact that he hadn't known in this specific instance was a detail and not an absolution. He called Amara. She picked up on the first ring. "What's happening?" she said. Not a greeting, a question, immediate, with the sharpened attention of someone who had been waiting for bad news and had stopped pretending otherwise. "The situation in Geneva is more complicated than I told you this morning," he said. "I need another 12 hours. "Damien." Her voice was controlled, but only just. "Noah has been asking about you since last night. He saw you leave our building on Monday, and he—" She stopped. "He described you to me. He said there was a man with dark hair who looked like he was thinking about something sad. He asked if you were okay." A pause. "My 4-year-old asked if a stranger outside our building was okay." The pavement under his feet felt less solid than it had. "I'm coming back," he said. "As soon as this is resolved, I promise you that." "How resolved?" "Completely." He paused. "I'm going to end the organization, Amar. Not restructure it, not hand it off. End it. Cooperate with the Brussels investigation, facilitate the asset dissolution, coordinate a legal exit that protects as many people in the structure as can be protected." He paused. "And then I'm going to get on a plane." Silence on the line. "That's everything," she said. "Yes." "You'd be left with whatever's legitimate, which isn't nothing, but it's not—" He stopped. "It's not the Empire. No." Another silence. Longer. He could hear her breathing, could hear the background sounds of wherever she was. Still Diane's, still somewhere that wasn't her apartment. Noah probably in the next room asking about something, about anything, the way 4-year-olds asked about everything with that relentless, patient curiosity that assumed the world was fundamentally explainable. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." 12 hours, Damien." He went back inside. The next 9 hours were the most concentrated work of his professional life, which was significant given the competition. He called his legal team first, not the internal counsel, but the external firm he retained personally for matters that required privilege and distance from the organization. He reached the senior partner at home and spoke to him for 40 minutes, and by the end of the call, a framework existed for voluntary cooperation with Brussels that would be initiated before the investigator's working day began. He called the Brussels contact directly next, a woman named Dr. Els Vanderberg, senior investigator, whom he had met exactly once at a function 2 years prior and had assessed as extremely competent and not corruptible. He identified himself. He told her he was initiating contact voluntarily. He told her the cooperating witness was dead and that she should know this before her morning briefing. The silence on her end lasted 4 full seconds. He told her he would have his legal team file cooperation documentation within 18 hours. She said, "Mr. Cross, I want to be very clear that voluntary cooperation at this stage does not guarantee—" "I know what it doesn't guarantee," he said. "I'm not calling for a guarantee. I'm calling because it's the right thing to do and because the alternative is a collapsing structure that hurts more people than a controlled dissolution." Another pause. Then, "We'll expect documentation by 8 a.m. tomorrow." He went back upstairs to Adrian. Adrian had not moved. He was sitting at the table with a glass of water and his jacket off, and he looked at Damien when he walked back in with an expression that had finished processing and arrived at something quieter. "I called Brussels," Damien said. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. "Okay. The witness is dead." Adrian's eyes opened. Something went through his face. I know." Damien looked at him steadily. "I know you didn't. The analysis of who did and why is something Brussels will work out. But the consequence is that the investigation just became unpredictable, which means the window for a controlled exit is narrower than you calculated." "How narrow?" "Days, possibly. Not months." He sat down across from Adrian. "I need everything you have, every document, every internal record, every communication that speaks to the organization's structure and my role in it. Not selected materials. Everything. My legal team will organize it, and I'll cooperate with the investigation fully." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to give them everything?" "Yes. That includes things that expose you directly." "I know what it includes." Damien held his gaze. "I built it. I know what's in it better than anyone." Adrian looked at the table surface. He looked at his hands. He had the expression of a man doing a calculation that was not mathematical. The kind of calculation you do when a structure you've operated inside for 14 years is coming down, and you're trying to understand what you are when it's gone. "What happens to me?" he said. "You cooperate too. You document your own role accurately. You do not minimize and you do not exaggerate. Your cooperation, combined with mine, may influence what Brussels ultimately pursues versus what gets dissolved through civil channels." Damien paused. "I'm not making you promises, but I'm telling you that the fastest way through this for both of us is complete disclosure." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, "The block meetings in the file Mira found. Were they real?" "2 of them. The third was a dinner in Vienna that Block attended for a different reason. I was there separately, and the encrypted record conflated the dates." He paused. "I wasn't as careful as I thought I was." "No one ever is." He looked at Damien. "You knew I'd give you everything." "I knew you'd run out of other options." "That's not the same thing." "No," Damien agreed. "It's not." They worked through the night, not together exactly. Damien at one end of the table, Adrian at the other, both of them feeding materials to the legal team via secure transfer, building the disclosure package piece by piece with the particular focus of people who have committed to a direction and are now simply executing it because the decision has been made and there is nothing left to do but the work. At 3:47 a.m., Damien's phone buzzed on the table. A message from a Geneva number he didn't recognize. He opened it. A photograph. No text. Just an image. He looked at it and felt his blood temperature drop by several degrees. It was a photograph of a Mars building in Brooklyn. Not the front entrance. The service entrance. The one Amara had used to leave 2 days ago. Taken recently, within the last hour, based on the street lighting. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, A child's red sneaker on the bottom step of the fire escape. Noah's sneaker. He had seen it. The mismatched Velcro. The red. He stood up from the table so fast his chair went back, and Adrian looked up from his materials with an expression that changed immediately when he saw Damien's face. What? Damien was already dialing. Amara's line, 1 ring, 2, 3, voicemail. He dialed the temporary number, voicemail. He dialed Diane's landline, which Amara had given him as a backup. 4 rings. A woman answered, sleep-roughened. Hello? Is Amara there? Damien said. A pause that was a half-second too long. She and her son went out about an hour ago. She said she needed something from where? His voice came out clipped, tight, stripped of everything but the question. Where did she say she was going? She didn't. She said it was a quick errand. She had her phone. He hung up. He looked at Adrian. Who else knew about New York, besides you and Block? Adrian's face had gone the color of old concrete. Damien, who else? I sent Jules Carver to run surveillance. That's it. That was the only operational contact. He stopped. His jaw tightened. Block. Block has his own people. He was in this room 6 hours ago. I know. And when I told him to leave, he knew the deal wasn't happening. I know. Adrian was already on his feet. Block's network runs a freelance contractor pool. I don't have the names. I never needed them. The arrangement was that he handled field operations and I handled... Call him. Damien's voice was very quiet. The quietest it had been all night. The kind of quiet that had nothing underneath it but cold. Call Block right now and tell him that whatever his people are doing in Brooklyn, he pulls them out in the next 10 minutes, or I make sure that the cooperation documentation I file with Brussels tomorrow morning contains his name on every instrument he ever touched in connection with this organization. Adrian already had his phone in his hand. Damien was already moving toward the door. Where are you going? Adrian said. Airport. The first flight to New York is... I'm not taking a commercial flight. He stopped at the door. His hand was on the frame. The professional calm that had held him through 2 days of structured crisis was still there, intact. But underneath it, something had broken through that was older and less disciplined than anything he'd operated from in years. Something that ran on a frequency he had forgotten he had access to, the specific animal frequency of a parent who believes his child is in danger. Get Block on the phone, right now. Tell him what I said. He went down the stairs and through the door and into the Geneva night at 4 a.m., the air cold and black and completely indifferent, and he moved through it toward the parking structure at the end of the block, with his phone already up, searching for the private charter contacts he kept for operational emergencies, and his mind was running 2 tracks simultaneously. The logistics track, efficient and precise, calculating flight times and Brooklyn geography, and how quickly he could get from JFK to Flatbush. And underneath it, the other track, the one that wasn't logical, the one that kept returning to the image of a small red sneaker on a fire escape step, and the 3 words Amara had texted him 3 hours ago, and the 4-year-old who had looked at a stranger outside a building and asked if he was okay. His phone rang. Adrian. He picked up. I reached Block. Adrian's voice was tight. He says his people aren't in Brooklyn. Damien stopped walking. What? He says Carver was pulled out yesterday after you spoke to her. He says he doesn't have anyone else deployed in New York. He says... Adrian paused, and when he spoke again, the tightness in his voice had changed quality, shifted into something that sounded less like operational strain and more like the early stage of a different kind of fear. He says the photograph you received didn't come from him. Damien stood in the Geneva street at 4 a.m. and felt the architecture of the situation rearrange itself for the 3rd time in 48 hours. Then who sent it? He said. Silence on the line. Not Adrian's silence. Adrian was there, breathing, but the silence of a question that neither of them had the answer to, which meant there was a party in this situation they had not yet identified, which meant the map of who knew about Amara and Noah and Brooklyn was larger than either of them had drawn. His phone buzzed against his ear, a second notification on the same line. He pulled it from his ear and looked at the screen. A second photograph. Same building, different angle. And this time, not just the sneaker. This time, in the narrow gap between the service door and the frame, the unmistakable shape of a small, dark-haired boy pressed against the wall, with an expression on his face that Damien had never seen before and would spend a long time not being able to forget. Noah. Looking at something outside the frame, looking at it with the concentrated, wide-eyed stillness of a child who has been told to be very quiet and is trying very hard to comply. Damien Cross put his phone in his pocket and started running. He chartered a flight out of Geneva Cointrain at 4:51 a.m. 7 seats, 1 passenger, a pilot who asked no questions because Damien was paying the kind of rate that purchased in curiosity. He spent the first hour of the flight trying to reach Amara on every number he had. The temporary phone, Diane's landline, Celine in Paris, who answered on the third ring with sleep in her voice and fear in it 2 seconds later when she heard his. Celine had not heard from Amara since the previous afternoon. He told her to stay by her phone. He hung up. He spent the second hour on the phone with a contact in the NYPD through 3 degrees of separation, a man named Garrett who owed a favor to someone who owed a favor to someone who worked for Damien. The long, loose chain of obligation that powerful men built precisely for moments like this. He gave Garrett the building address and described Amara and Noah and said there may be a situation developing and he needed eyes on the location, low profile, no sirens, just a presence. Garrett said he'd send a car. Damien sat back in the seat and looked at the dark Atlantic beneath the plane and thought about who had sent the photographs. Not Block. Block had confirmed his people weren't in New York, and Damien believed him. Not because Block was trustworthy, but because Block's operational logic made the photographs unnecessary. Block had wanted the signatures. The signatures were gone. There was no remaining leverage play that required photographs of a child on a fire escape at 4 a.m. Not Adrian. Adrian's entire play had been built on managed distance, surveillance, information, the careful use of Amara and Noah as a pressure mechanism rather than a direct threat. Adrian didn't operate through fear. He operated through architecture, which left the question open in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. A third party, unknown, with access to the building address in Brooklyn, with knowledge of Amara and Noah's connection to Damien, and with a purpose in sending those photographs that Damien could not yet read. He ran every name he could think of through the filter of motive and access. He ran them twice. On the third pass, he stopped at a name that he had not considered because he had not had reason to consider it, a name that had been on the periphery of several events he was now reconstructing in sequence. And when he placed that name inside the sequence suddenly made a different kind of sense. He made one phone call, a number he had not dialed in over 2 years. A man answered. Victor Sane, 67, former structural architect of 3 of Damien's most complex financial arrangements, retired to a house in Montreux. A man who had known everything about the organization's anatomy and had left it cleanly, or so Damien had believed, 18 months ago. Victor, Damien said. A pause. Then, in the particular voice of a man who has been waiting to be called and has rehearsed exactly how he will sound when it happens. Damien, I wondered when. The photographs, Damien said, were they yours? A longer pause, then, I needed you moving. You were sitting in that office building paperwork deals with Adrian, and the clock was running. A breath. The boy was already outside. The woman had taken him out herself. I didn't put them in danger. I just documented where they were and sent you the documentation. You sent me photographs of my son on a fire escape at 4 a.m. I sent you a reason to get on a plane. Oh, Victor's voice was flat, but not cold. It had the quality of a man who has made a decision he believes in and is willing to defend it. Because if you sat in Geneva doing your careful legal dissolution while the Brussels investigation pivoted, you would have missed the window entirely. You would have lost the ability to control the narrative. I know how you operate, Damien. You needed a fire under you. You used my child. I took photographs of a building. Your child happened to be visible. Victor. Damien's voice had gone to the place it had gone with Adrian. Very quiet, very cold, very final. If Amara and Noah are not exactly where I expect them to be when I land, this conversation becomes a different kind of conversation. Do you understand me? They're fine. No hesitation. I had someone watch the building from across the street. Not inside, not near them. A set of eyes. They are in the building, they are safe. And the neighbor's apartment they retreated to is on the third floor and has been undisturbed all night. A pause. I'm sorry for the method. I'm not sorry for the outcome. You're on a plane. That's what needed to happen. Damien sat with this for a long moment. The plane moved through the dark and the dark moved past the window, and below it, the Atlantic was invisible and enormous. Why? He said. What is your stake in this? Victor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the rehearsed quality was gone, and what was underneath it was older and more complicated. Because I built half of those financial structures with you. Because my name is attached to instruments that are going to come under Brussels scrutiny, whether I'm retired or not. And because... He paused. Because I watched you build something that cost you everything that wasn't itself. And I watched you not notice, and I'm too old to watch that happen again without doing something about it. He stopped. Get to New York. Fix it. Then fix the Brussels thing, in that order. Damien ended the call. He looked out the window at the dark for a long time. Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in 4 days he slept, briefly and without dreaming, because his body had reached the outer limit of what will alone could sustain. Tots. JFK at 7:43 a.m., gray November morning, the city announcing itself through the cab window in the particular way it always did. Too much, all at once, completely indifferent. He had Garrett's text waiting for him when he landed. Car on location, all quiet, no activity. He called Amara from the cab. This time she picked up on the second ring, and the sound of her voice, alert, cautious, alive, loosened something in his chest that had been wound tight for 6 hours. Where are you? He said. Third floor, Diane's neighbor. We've been here since last night got weird. A pause. There was a man across the street. I saw him from the window. He wasn't Carver, different build, older. He was just watching, not moving, for hours. I know who he was, Damien said. He's not a threat. I'll explain when I get there. He paused. Is Noah asleep? He's been awake since 5. He's currently reorganizing Diane's neighbor's spice rack by height. A sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. He's fine. He doesn't know anything is wrong. He thinks this is an extended sleepover. Damien looked out the cab window at the highway. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He was there in 32, so Amara met him at the building door. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on the day before, her hair loose, and she looked at him with the expression she had used throughout, the controlled one, the one that held everything at a slight distance. But underneath it, just barely, was something that had been frightened and was relieved and was not ready to show the relief yet. She looked at his face. You didn't sleep. A little. On the plane. You look terrible. I know. He stood on the step below her so they were at the same level, and he looked at her and said, Victor Sane sent the photographs. He's a former... I know who Victor Sane is, she crossed her arms. He was at our wedding. Yes. Damien paused. He wasn't a threat. He wanted me moving faster than I was moving, and he used a method I would not have chosen, and I've told him that. Amara looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold, and the street was beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood waking up, and none of it had any relationship to the conversation on this doorstep. Is it over? She said. The Geneva situation. Not entirely. I've initiated cooperation with the Brussels investigation. The legal dissolution is going to take weeks, possibly months, with my team managing it. But the operational structure... He paused. Yes, that part is over. She nodded once, slowly, processing it. Adrian, she said, is cooperating. He's documenting his role. His future is Brussels' decision, not mine. He paused. He made bad choices. Some of them were about protecting himself. Some of them were about protecting something he thought couldn't survive without him making those choices. He paused. That doesn't make them right, but it's the complete picture. Amara looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. Come up, she said. Noah has been asking about the man with the dark hair since yesterday. I'm not going to make you stand on the doorstep. He followed her up the stairs. The neighbor's apartment smelled like coffee and old books and something faintly floral that he couldn't identify, and it had the overfull, lived-in quality of a space belonging to someone who had accumulated things over a long time and seen no reason to reduce them. It was the opposite of the Geneva penthouse in every possible way. Noah was at the kitchen table. He was 4 years old and small for it, with dark hair that went in several directions at once, and his mother's posture, so straight, self-contained, already occupying space with a certain deliberateness. He had an array of spice jars in front of him, organized in a line from shortest to tallest, and he was studying the arrangement with the concentrated frown of someone conducting an audit. He looked up when Damien came into the kitchen. He looked at Damien's face for a moment with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who had not yet learned that staring was considered rude. Then he said, "You're the man from outside." Damien stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Yes," he said. "Mom said you were a friend." He glanced at Amara, who was standing at the counter with her arms still crossed and her expression carefully neutral. He looked back at Noah. "That's right." Noah considered this. He looked at Damien's hair, which was dark and went in several directions of its own, and then looked at his own reflection in the dark surface of a nearby jar, and then looked back at Damien with the particular expression of a 4-year-old who has noticed something and filed it without yet knowing what category to put it in. "You can sit down," Noah said, with the grave authority of a child in a space he has temporarily colonized. "I'm doing the spices." Damien sat down at the kitchen table across from his son. He sat there and watched Noah return to the spice organization with complete focus, and he breathed, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was the right size for this moment. Nothing that could fit between the 4 years that were gone and the person sitting across from him arranging jars by height with the total seriousness of someone for whom this was the most important work currently underway. Amara poured coffee. She set a cup in front of Damien without asking if he wanted it. He wrapped both hands around it, and the warmth went through his palms and up his arms, and he sat in the kitchen of a stranger's apartment in Brooklyn with his son 3 feet away, and felt something that he could not name cleanly, but that was, underneath everything else, the most straightforward thing he had ever felt. "What's your name?" Noah said, without looking up from the jars. Damien glanced at Amara. She was looking at the window, not avoiding it, just giving him the space to answer. "Damien," he said. Noah tested the word quietly, the way children do. "Damian." "Yes." "That's a long name." "It is." Noah moved a jar of paprika 1 inch to the left and studied the result. "I'm Noah," he said. "I know," Damien said. "Your mom told me." Noah looked up at him then, direct, clear, with those eyes that Damien had seen in a photograph on a plane, and understood immediately and completely. "Are you staying?" he said. The question was simple and enormous, and had no pretense behind it. A 4-year-old asking a logistical question about the immediate future. No subtext, no weight, just the honest inquiry of a child trying to understand how the next hour was arranged. Damien looked at Amara. She was looking at him now. Her arms had uncrossed. She was holding her coffee cup with both hands and looking at him with an expression that had finally let some of the careful distance drop. Not all of it, not an invitation, but a lowering of one specific wall, the one that had been saying, "I am not going to let you see that I am relieved you are here." "For a while," Damien said to Noah. "Yes." Noah nodded, satisfied with this, and returned to the spices. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple or cinematic in the way that resolutions sometimes pretended to be. The Brussels investigation ran its course with Damien's full cooperation and his legal team's management. 2 of the 4 anticipated asset freezes were avoided through proactive disclosure. The other 2 went through the civil process and were resolved without criminal proceedings against Damien personally, an outcome that his lawyer described as remarkable given the circumstances, and that Damien accepted without celebration because it was not a victory so much as a lesser cost than the alternative, and he understood the difference. Adrian Vale received a formal agreement with the Brussels authority that classified his cooperation as substantial and limited his personal liability to financial penalties rather than prosecution. He left Geneva in February for somewhere that wasn't disclosed, which Damien understood was a kind of answer to the question of what you were when the structure that had defined you for 14 years was gone. He sent Damien one message, 3 weeks after it was all finalized. I should have come to you directly 14 months ago. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it anyway. Damien read it twice and did not respond, not because he was unwilling to, but because he was not yet certain what the honest response was. And he had decided that if he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to operate with more honesty than he'd managed in the previous decade, he should not begin by saying something that sounded right but wasn't quite true. Victor Sane called once, in January, to ask how things were going. Damien told him. Victor listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. At the end he said, "Good, that's good." And then, "The boy, what's he like?" And Damien had stood in the kitchen of the sublet apartment in Park Slope he was renting month to month and thought about how to answer that. And what he said was, he organizes things, everything, by size, by color, by some system I can't always follow, but that always turns out to have an internal logic. A pause. He's 4, and he already argues better than half the people I've negotiated with. And Victor laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere unguarded, and said, "Well, that tracks." And that was the last conversation they had, and it was enough. Block withdrew from any arrangement connected to Damien's organization without contact or confrontation. The documentation Damien had threatened to file was sufficient to make the calculation clear, and men like Block were nothing if not efficient calculators. He was heard from 6 months later in connection with a different venture in a different market, which Damien was told about and did not act on, because it was no longer his table. Jules Carver, the woman in the gray coat, sent Damien an invoice through a third-party intermediary for the days she had spent in Brooklyn, which he found darkly funny in a specific way, and paid without comment because the invoice was accurate and because holding a grudge against a contractor for doing contracted work seemed like the wrong use of the energy he was trying to redirect. He did not move into Amar's apartment. This was important, and she had made it clear before he'd had a chance to suggest it, which told him she had been thinking about it, which told him more than the content of the boundary itself. He rented the Park Slope sublet, 20 minutes from Flatbush by subway, 12 by car, and he built a presence rather than a position. He called before coming. He came when she said it was okay. He sat at her kitchen table and ate the dinners she cooked without making it mean more than it was. A meal, an hour, a small ordinary piece of time in which a family that was not yet a family practiced being in the same room. Noah adapted to him the way children adapted to new constants, gradually, then suddenly. For the first 3 weeks, he treated Damien with a friendly indifference that was actually quite comfortable to operate inside. Then one Saturday morning in December, Damien arrived to take him to a park, and Noah came to the door already in his coat, both sneakers on the right feet for once, and looked at Damien and said, with the absolute confidence of a child announcing a settled conclusion, "You came back." "I did," Damien said. "You said you would, and you did," Noah said, nodding as though ticking something off a list. Then he pushed past Damien into the hallway and said, "Let's go, I want to see the big fountain." Amara appeared in the doorway behind him with a look on her face that she covered quickly, but not before Damien saw it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything that the moment didn't need. The park was cold and nearly empty. Noah ran ahead on the path toward the fountain with his arms out for balance on a slippery section of pavement, and Damien walked behind him with his hands in his pockets and watched the way a 4-year-old moved through the world, confident about physics and optimistic about friction in ways that experience had not yet corrected. And he thought about the distance between where he had been 3 months ago and where he was now, which was not a large physical distance, but was, by every other measure, almost incomprehensibly large. Amara was beside him, not touching, not close enough to touch, but present in the specific way she had been since he'd come back. Adjacent, watching, making incremental decisions about proximity, the way you approach something hot that you weren't yet sure was safe. "He told his teacher about you," she said. Damien looked at her. What did he say? He said he had a friend named Damien who knew a lot about thinking. She kept her eyes on Noah ahead on the path. The teacher asked what that meant. He said, she paused and her jaw moved slightly. He said it means he thinks about things a long time before he does them. Like me. She stopped. He said, like me. Self-referentially. At 4 years old. Damien looked at the back of his son's head, the dark hair, the serious little posture. He's not wrong, he said. I know. Her voice was quiet. That's what made it hard to hear. He looked at her. She was looking at the path ahead, and her expression was the one she wore when she was feeling something she had not yet decided to share, the careful one, the one with the walls. But she was standing beside him on a path in a park in December, and she had told him about the teacher, which was a thing she had not needed to tell him, which meant something about the direction things were moving even if the movement was slow. Amara, he said. She looked at him. I know this isn't fixed, he said. I know there are things between us that aren't going to resolve because I showed up and cooperated with a federal investigation and signed some legal documents and come to the park on Saturdays. I know that. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to pretend any of that isn't true. She was quiet for a moment. What are you asking? Nothing right now. He paused. I'm just telling you that I know, so you don't have to hold it by yourself. She looked at him for a long time. The cold moved through the park, and Noah had reached the fountain, shut off for winter, the basin empty and slightly melancholy, and was walking around its circumference with the measuring, focused attention of someone conducting an assessment, talking to himself quietly in the way he did when he was working something out. The other night, Amar said, still looking at Noah, he woke up at 2 a.m., and I went in to sit with him. He does this sometimes. He's not scared. He just wakes up and wants company, wants to know someone's there. She paused. He asked me if you had a mom. Damien said nothing, just waited. I said I thought you probably did once. He thought about that for a while, and then he said... She stopped. Her throat moved. He said, I hope she knew he was going to be okay. She looked at Damien then, directly, the walls down for just this one moment. He's 4 years old, and that's the thought he had. The park was quiet around them, and the cold was present and real, and Noah moved around the fountain's edge, talking to himself about something important, and Damien Cross stood beside the woman he had failed and the son he had never known and felt, without sentiment and without illusion, exactly what it cost to have been the kind of person he had been, and exactly what it would take to be something different, and understood that both things were true simultaneously, and that there was no version of moving forward that didn't carry the weight of both. He did not reach for her hand. It wasn't yet that. But he stayed beside her. He stayed exactly there, in the cold, present, not moving away. And when Noah looked up from the fountain and found them both on the path, and lifted one hand in a small wave, the uncomplicated wave of a child confirming that the people he expects to be there are there, Damien lifted his hand back. Spring came the way it always came to Brooklyn, gradually and then all at once. One morning, when the light through the window was different and the air through a cracked door smelled like something green and new, Noah turned 5 in late March, and Amara let Damien come to the small birthday gathering. 4 children from Noah's class, 2 parents, Celine visiting from Paris, and Damien standing in the kitchen cutting cake with the careful focus of a man who was acutely aware of being a guest in a life he had not yet earned full residency in. Celine found him there. She stood beside him and looked at the living room through the kitchen doorway where Noah was conducting the brutal, joyful business of 5-year-old birthday politics, and she said quietly, She hasn't forgiven you. I know, Damien said, but she's thinking about it. Celine looked at him sideways. Which is different, which is something she wouldn't have been doing 6 months ago. She paused. Don't rush it. I'm not. She looked at him for a moment. You're different, she said. From what? From who you were. At the wedding, at the functions before. She considered it. You were always in the room, but you were always managing the room. Now you're just... She paused. In it. He thought about this. Yes, he said. It looks better on you, she said, and took a piece of cake and went back to the living room. And that was Celine. Efficient, accurate, done. Basam. The empire dissolved officially in the third week of April. The final legal instrument was filed by his lawyer in Brussels and countersigned, and the structure that had taken 14 years to build was, as a formal matter, finished. Damien's legitimate holdings, a real estate portfolio, 2 investment positions, a consulting arrangement through a fully compliant financial advisory firm, were enough to build a different kind of life. Not the Geneva penthouse, something proportionally smaller in every direction, which was, he had concluded, closer to the right size. He did not feel the way he had expected to feel when it was done. He had expected something heavier. Grief, maybe? Or the specific dislocation of a man whose defining work has ended. What he felt instead was something that arrived quietly, without announcement, sitting in the Park Slope sublet on an April evening with the window open and the street sounds coming through and a small set of toy cars Noah had left on the coffee table after Saturday arranged by color in a careful line. He picked up one of the cars, turned it over in his hand, set it back in its place. He called Amara. She picked up. In the background, he could hear Noah's voice. Bath time, the specific battle of it, the negotiation about how many more minutes. Hey, she said. Hey, he paused. It's done. The Brussels filing. A beat. How do you feel? Fine, he said. And then, because he had made a commitment to honesty, and the commitment was most important precisely when it was inconvenient. Not fine exactly, something I don't have a word for yet. She was quiet for a moment. That's probably the right way to feel about it. Yeah. He looked at the toy cars. I wanted to tell you before anything else. Another pause. Longer. On her end, he heard Noah's voice rise in protest about something, and Amara's voice respond in the patient, firm register she used when she had said a thing 3 times and was about to say it a 4th. Come for dinner Sunday, she said. Noah wants to show you something he built with his blocks. He's been talking about it since Thursday. Damien looked at the window. The April evening was still light, and the street outside was ordinary and real and entirely sufficient. I'll be there, he said. She hung up. He set his phone on the table beside the toy cars and sat in the quiet apartment and breathed. Outside, a kid on the street below was arguing with another kid about something that couldn't be heard clearly. Just the music of it, the back and forth, the ordinary, passionate disagreement of children who were invested in the outcome and confident that it mattered. He sat with that sound for a while. He thought about Noah in the park, walking the perimeter of the empty fountain, talking to himself, working something out. He thought about the small wave, the uncomplicated confirmation that the people he expected were where he expected them. He thought about Amara standing beside him on the cold path with one wall down for one moment, the raw and insufficient truth of what they both were carrying and what it meant that she was still standing there. He had built something that had taken everything. He had believed for a long time that this was the same as having built something great. He understood now that it was not. What was great was a 5-year-old who organized spice jars by height and left toy cars in a careful line and woke up at 2 a.m. and thought about whether a stranger knew that things were going to be okay. What was great was a woman who had carried a secret across an ocean and built a life on the other side of it with her own hands and had let him sit at her kitchen table and had said, "Come for dinner Sunday," through the sounds of a bath time argument with the same practical, undecorated directness she applied to everything. The empire was gone. Sunday was 4 days away. He picked up the nearest toy car and set it precisely back in line with the others, and then he got up and went to the kitchen and started figuring out what to bring.